Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short, sharp session on G.R.O.W. Tim Baker's my name, and I'm going to run through a great coaching model and share with you how to use G.R.O.W. in the workplace. So you'll get an opportunity at the end of this. I'll send you a copy of the slides and the recording. So you don't need to worry about taking any notes. You'll get all of that at the end of the session. So let's launch into the presentation, and I'll just share my screen. And let's launch into the presentation. Now, for those of you who don't know me, Tim Baker, as I said, is my name. As you can see, I do a variety of things. I'm a platform speaker. I run workshops. I write books. And one of the books, of course, that I'm going to be talking about today, not directly, but indirectly, will be Breaking the Proactive Paradox. And that is the book where I talk about G.R.O.W. to great extent. I also play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition still here in Brisbane. And you can see for this fellow chasing me, you learn to take off fairly quickly. So when you've got someone like that chasing you, you run pretty fast. So let's get into the presentation and look at some of the key objectives. Now, the key question that I want to address in this particular session is, how do I stop answering questions from my team members that I know they can answer themselves? Now, I'm sure you've been in that position where you've had people come to your desk and they want to ask you a question, and you know to yourself, you know in your heart that they actually know the answer to that question. So what do you do? How do you deflect it back? How do you make that other person responsible for the answer? That's where G.R.O.W. comes in, and I want to talk about it in that context. All right, so I want to talk about the proactive paradox, which is, part of the heading of my book, and explain how that works, because that's critical to coaching. I'll obviously spend a fair bit of time in our short session talking about the G.R.O.W. model itself. And at the end of this presentation, I have a special offer for you that you might like to take advantage of. All right, so let's talk about the proactive paradox. Now, we use this word paradox quite a lot. What do we mean by it? The best way I can explain it is to think about the question, does the chicken come first or does the egg come first? That's a paradox. Which of those is the one that's likely to happen first and foremost? So let's have a look at what we mean by a proactive paradox. On my screen there, I've got a very simple diagram that shows you what the proactive paradox is. And it basically works like this. You as a leader, I'm sure, want your team members to show an exercise initiative, of course, the right initiative, but you want them to show prudent initiative, to show their autonomy in different situations. So there's no doubt about that. All leaders want that. But the good news is that also all your team members want to show, or most of your team members want to show autonomy in the right place at the right time, in the right way. So at the beginning of this relationship that you've got with your team members, everybody's actually on the same page. Everybody either wants to exercise or have exercise autonomy. Now, something very unusual happens. After a while, you might make an announcement in a team meeting that you want people to actually exercise their autonomy and initiative. And everyone in the meeting sits there quietly listening to you, and you basically, it falls on deaf ears. And what happens is everybody sits back, or they sit on their hands, because they're not convinced that you really mean that. So they want to play it safe. So they don't actually exercise autonomy and initiative, even though they want to do that, because they're not sure whether you really mean that. Now, because they step back, you end up getting frustrated. You get frustrated because you want them to jump into the arena and take full advantage of the situation. But because they don't, you get frustrated, and you get very frustrated because you've made that announcement. That's your expectation. but people aren't responding. So by you jumping in, what you have actually done in the third element is that you have confirmed to your team members that you don't really want people to show autonomy. Because if you really wanted to, you wouldn't have been jumping into the arena doing a lot of the activities that your team was supposed to do. So what it does in the minds of the team members is it consolidates in their mind this idea that you don't really want to show initiative. And that's what the proactive paradox is. So there's essentially three elements to it. There is an agreement at the outset, and the agreement, of course, is that you want people to show autonomy, and people are willing to show autonomy. Now, because there is a delayed reaction, and because there's a vacuum, you fill that vacuum. So what happens is the next level is skepticism. So people are very skeptical about you wanting them to show initiative. And of course, when you jump in and do the jobs that you're expecting your team members to do, it confirms in their mind, my leader doesn't really want me to show initiative. So that's how the paradox works. Now, we can break that proactive paradox in a number of ways. Now, one of the ways, of course, that we can break that is through the G.R.O.W model, by using G.R.O.W, because one of the great strengths of the G.R.O.W model is it makes the other person completely accountable and basically responsible for doing the job that you want them to do. So let's delve in deeper and actually have a look at how G.R.O.W actually works. So G.R.O.W, for those who may not know, stands for goal, reality, options, and way forward. So it's a very easy concept to remember, and all you've got to do is just remember G.R.O.W and remember what it stands for. So what it essentially means is that you ask the person what they're trying to achieve, you find out what's stopping them, which is the reality, and then you ask them what their options are, and you'll notice that that's plural. So basically, there might be several different options to solving the problem. But the point is that the person on the receiving end of the coaching session comes up with those options. And then, of course, you confirm a way forward as a result of that. So it's a very simple way of giving the responsibility and autonomy back to the individual. All you've got to do is to bite your tongue until it bleeds and not respond directly to the answer to the question that the person might be asking you at that time. And that's how it works. So let's look at it a little deeper in each of these levels. So G.R.O.W. I find there are many managers who actually write G.R.O.W on their whiteboard, and it just reminds them that the next time they're going to be interrupted, whether it's on a telephone call, a conference call, or in person, that they shouldn't just simply answer the question. The problem when you answer the question is that you are perpetuating this proactive paradox. By answering the question, you're basically saying to the individual, come to me whenever you've got a problem and I'll give you an answer. Whilst that'll give you a quick sugar hit at the beginning, all it's doing is training that person to keep coming back to you, when in actual fact, they can take responsibility themselves for doing what they need to do. So that's where it comes into play, and it's very, very powerful. So let's have a look at each of these. Now, I'm not going to run through each question because we just don't have time, but you don't have to ask all of these questions. So for example, at the outset, when someone comes to you, any of these questions that you've got in front of you, you can ask, or maybe a couple of them. It obviously depends on how complex the problem is or the dilemma that they're facing in the workplace. But of course, you want to know that it's quite logical, isn't it, to be able to start with where they want to finish up. Because by starting where they want to finish up, you know, and they know that they have a clear outcome that they're after. Now, most people can answer that. Obviously, if you can't answer that, then it's a good place to start, because if you don't know what the ideal outcome is, then obviously you need to talk about that. So we start by asking a simple question like, what are you trying to achieve? And ultimately, when the person articulates to you what they're trying to achieve, you've now got a very clear vision where they're wanting to go. Now, you may well know where they want to go, and they may well know where they want to go, but by actually articulating it, you're in a position now where you can aim for that goal. Now, once you've done that, the next step is to ask them what the reality is. Now, by that, what I mean is, what are the barriers, the main barriers that are getting in the way of success? Obviously, there are barriers, because if there weren't barriers, the person wouldn't be coming to you. Now, normally what happens is that a manager will sit there for 45 minutes and listen to somebody drone on about all the issues that are going on in the workplace. And you've been taught to listen. 45 minutes later, nothing's been resolved except the fact that they have dumped a whole lot of barriers on your desk. So the key thing to ask there is, what is the main barrier that's stopping you achieving what you want to achieve? Now, once you've identified the main barrier, you may well ask them, are there other barriers that are in the way? Again, you may well know what the barriers are. And that's not the point. The point is, do they know, and can they articulate those barriers to you? And once we've worked out what the barriers are, we're now in a position where we know where they're heading, and we know what's stopping them get to where they're heading. And that's a good starting point in any coaching session, because the next step, of course, is to actually try to resolve the gap between where they want to go and where they are right now. And that's where the O comes in. So when we get to the O, which is options, your job then is to ask people what their options are. Now, they may say to you, of course, well, that's why I'm coming to you. But of course, you can say, well, just imagine if I wasn't here, what would your options be? And you wait patiently and ask them the question. Now, if they give you a viable option, you can then say to them, well, what are some other options that are open to you that perhaps you haven't thought about? Now, particularly with a complex problem, this is a very useful supplementary question. So what are your other options? What are some other things that you can do to get yourself to where you need to be? Now, I warn you that this is the most difficult part of the exercise, because often you know what the options are, but the point is, do they know? And what you're doing is you're getting them to take complete responsibility for the options. And so it's always good to have more than one option, because if you've got more than one option, what you're doing is you're empowering the other person to think about other ways of being able to resolve this problem. So once we've got the options, where are we now? We know where you're going with the G. We know what's stopping you with the R. And we now have a series of options open to you, or open to them, to resolving the problem. So now the rubber meets the road, where we get to the last question, or series of questions, around way forward. So the next set of questions, and really it probably could be as simple as asking them, okay, what's the next step? What's the first thing that you need to do, having left my office, to move yourself in the right direction? So what that does is it gives you a very good sense of what the person has committed to doing, and it also validates for them what they perhaps thought they might do anyway. So the idea of that last one is so that you can feel confident that they will get into action and they will do what they need to do to resolve the problem. So that's pretty much G.R.O.W in a nutshell. And quite frankly, you can get away with 4 questions to run through a G.R.O.W model. For example, you can say, what are you trying to achieve? G. What's stopping you? R. What are your options? O. And what's the next step? W. So what you've effectively done is, not only have you reduced the time that this conversation should normally take, but you've also empowered the other person to take the responsibility that they need to. So what you're actually doing is you're breaking the proactive paradox. You're giving that person a sense of responsibility for solving their own problems, which is ultimately what you should be aiming to do. So that's how simple it is. The hard part in this is not remembering G.R.O.W. The hard part is actually stopping yourself answering the questions, because you want to empower the other person to answer the questions. That's why G.R.O.W is so effective and so useful. Now, when would you use G.R.O.W? Now, there are many circumstances where you can use G.R.O.W in the workplace, and here are some that I think are very, very useful. This doesn't have to be a set coaching session. It can happen in a corridor conversation. So somebody comes up to you and you weren't expecting it, and they can drop a problem on your lap. And what you can do then is revert to G.R.O.W. So an impromptu meeting, all you've got to do is to remember to use G.R.O.W in those examples. It can also be used very effectively when you've got a coaching session, where you've actually got a set coaching session. So you're sitting down in your normal get together with your team member, and they've raised an issue with you. And during that time, when they've raised the issue, after they've raised it with you, you can launch into G.R.O.W. And in that sense, it's very, very effective. So the other possibility is if there's a problem that somebody wants to solve and they don't know the answer to it, and maybe you don't know the answer to it either. So what you can do is, of course, you can use G.R.O.W as a brainstorming strategy. So by going through the 4 stages that I went through, you can help the other person resolve their problem. And that is very effective, because the person will walk away with a spring in their step, knowing that they feel a lot more confident and a lot more empowered to solve the problem. Of course, if you're delegating something to somebody, which is a little complex, you can then go through a G.R.O.W model when you're delegating. So by delegating something to someone, you can actually say, well, let's just walk our way through how you might go about this. And then you launch into, okay, what's the main aim here? What is the reality? What are some of the barriers that are likely to stop you? What are some of the options you think that might be viable to solving this problem, or this, this task that I've given you? And what might be some of the things that you can get onto straight away to resolve? So that works very well with delegation. At the beginning of a project, when you're just starting out in a project with your team, you can do this collectively with the whole team. So you can get your whole team together, expecting that the whole team will involve themselves in the problem solving of the project. And so again, you can go through G.R.O.W in a project-based environment at the beginning of the project. So it gives you a really good structure to map out how the project will be resolved. So that works extremely well. It can be used during check-ins. So I like to call them catch-ups, actually. So these are your monthly catch-ups with your team members, and you can use them as a way of, prompting the person into action. And again, giving that person the onus and responsibility to solving the problem. And that can be extremely effective as well. You can also use it in between check-ins. So these might be issues that arise. They might be impromptu. They've come to you about a problem and you're expected to resolve it. Then you can just launch into G.R.O.W that way. So that can be very, very effective. So just to sum up, G.R.O.W is an outstanding tool because, one, it's simple. All you've got to remember is G.R.O.W. It's not as if you've got to have great skills in asking questions. If you can remember what G.R.O.W. stands for, then the value of that, of course, is just ask a question similar to the questions that I've just suggested to you. It can be used in all situations. So G.R.O.W is something that I'd like you to try in a range of different forums in your workplace. And look, the first time you do it, it might seem a little uncomfortable, but I can assure you that after a while, it'll get very comfortable. And more importantly, the people that are coming to you with the problems also know that you are prepared to use this model. What that means is two things. It means that either the other person will not need to come to you because they've already thought through the problem, so they're empowered, or when they come to you, they've already thought about the answers to the very predictable questions that you're going to ask them about the problem. And that is a great outcome because it reduces the amount of time that people will come to you with situations that they themselves can resolve. It can also enable others. And what it does is that by walking them through this process, they get a sense of empowerment and enablement because they know what they need to do. They know how they can go about doing it. And all they've got to do now is get on and do it, which is wonderful. Now, despite what people might think, this actually does save you time. How? Well, it seems like this could take a long time, but in actual fact, it's a much shorter process than it would be for you to sit there in an unstructured way and listen to somebody, raving on about a problem and talking about a whole bunch of things that have absolutely nothing to do with the problem itself. So this gives you something where you can basically focus the person's attention on what needs to be done and not feeling as if, you've got to spend that 45 minutes listening to people, complaining or whatever. And of course, the final reason or the final benefit of G.R.O.W is it works. And I would just ask you to try it. It works really, really well. And it's based on a logical process. It's a simple process. It enables the person to take control of their own destiny. And that in itself is a great thing. So you can see there are a lot of benefits in using this. G.R.O.W's not the only coaching model that's out there, as I'm sure you're aware. There are many, but I find that many of them are quite complex and hard to remember. But I think the great strength of G.R.O.W is twofold. It's simple and it's effective. And perhaps a third one that's critically important here is it actually enables the other person to act, which is ultimately about breaking the proactive paradox that I talked about. Now, so I would urge you to give that a go. Excuse me. So what I'd like to do now is just finish up by sharing with you that you might be aware that every Friday at 10 o'clock, certainly this time in Brisbane time, I have one of these sessions. And one of these sessions is a very practical session for 30 minutes on a topic from one of my books. So next week, next Friday, I'm going to look at utilizing team diversity for high performance. Now, don't think I'm talking about gender or ethnicity here. I'm actually talking about people's thinking styles. I'm suggesting that we could much better use the way people think. You know yourself, there are blue sky thinkers. There are people who basically think in detail. There are extroverts. There are introverts. There are value-based decision makers and analytical decision makers. So there's a range of different people that you have in your team. And in order to have a high-performing team, one of the 8 characteristics is actually utilizing team diversity. So I'm going to talk about that next week from my book, Winning Teams, the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. So when you receive the slides, all you've got to do is click on that link, just as you did for today. That will get you registered, and we'll see you, of course, next week. So I'd urge you to come along. Finally, I've got a little incentive for you. My book, Breaking the Proactive Paradox, Maximizing Performance Through Empowerment, is now out. It was released last week. It's hot off the press. And the great news for you is I'm offering you a significant discount. If you go onto Amazon, you will find that the cost of the book will be $53 plus postage. Now, if that scares you off a little bit, I'm going to now give you a different price. And today I'm going to give it to you for half price. All you have to do in order to take advantage of that is send me an email by the close of business today, and I will make sure I've got a whole batch of books here in my office. I will sign them for you and I'll send them out, and you'll get your book. And of course, I'll send you an invoice as well. So that's a great offer, and it's only offered to you by the close of business today. And I'd urge you to take advantage of that great offer. Okay. So I hope, folks, you found that useful. G.R.O.W is a great use of your time. You will find that it'll help you break that proactive paradox that I talked about at the beginning of the session. And you'll find that it works extremely well, and you'll get wonderful results from it. There is absolutely no doubt about that. But it just requires you to change your thinking a little bit and realize that, in actual fact, my job is not to give people answers. My job is actually to help people to get the answers. And ultimately, what G.R.O.W does is lead people to a logical conclusion and outcome, and helps to empower them to get the results that you want them to get anyway. So give it a shot. I strongly recommend it. And hopefully we'll catch you all next week on Friday at 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. And hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel with this COVID business, because we certainly deserve a break, don't we? Thanks, everyone. All the best. Catch you next week. See you later. Goodbye.